Hello, everyone. My name is Dan Morris, and I've been with ABPMP since 2005. And during that time, I have served on the Chicago board and on the international board. And I led the rewrite of the Common Body of Knowledge, the current version, version 3. And just a little bit of background on the rewrite itself. The rewrite involved over 25 people. We had chapter authors, and then we had, first of all, a review of all the authors of all of the chapters. We then moved to a two-review process. So we reviewed it once with a separate group of people, and then we reviewed it again, some of the same people, some new people again. What we were trying to do is to have a collaborative view of the topics in the CBOK. So the CBOK today presents that composite or group view of specialists in the fields, specialists certainly in the topics of each of the chapters. So we have that composite view, and the result is that the CBOK has been fully vetted, and it represents the combined experiences of a great many very senior level people in the field. Today is the fourth of a monthly series on the CBOK. We'll be looking at Chapter 4 today. We are having the chapters presented by the authors, the main authors of the chapters, to provide some insights to the attendees on the author's perspectives and experiences that went into the base text of each chapter. Now, at the end of the session, we'll have a question and answer period. I'll be collecting the questions that come in throughout the session, and then we'll be asking Gabriel to address those questions. Now, please keep your phones on mute so that we don't get a lot of background noise. And we don't know, sometimes we don't have an opportunity just from a time standpoint to address all the questions. For those questions that we may not have an opportunity to address, if you either send me your contact information with the question or contact Gabriel Field directly on the ABPMP website or through the website, she'll be happy to answer any questions that we may not have time to get to. Now, today is Chapter 4, which is Process Analysis, and it's my pleasure to introduce the chapter author, Gabriel Field. And Gabriel currently leads the BPM effort called Smart Grid Modernization at a major utility, and she has served as the Vice President of Improvement and the Senior Manager for Strategy and Technology Alignment at Raymond James Financial. She's also been a member of the board of the association, ABPMP, and she's served in a variety of capacities. She is one of the authors of the CBOK. She's been on that committee. She was the Vice President of Certification for several years, and she's also been the President of the Tampa chapter for several years. Gabriel, thank you for joining us today, and I'll turn the session over to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for that nice introduction, Dan. I also want to thank you and those on the phone who've been involved in the major effort to get this CBOK rewritten. I know it was a huge effort, but it's very nice to sit here today and see the outcome and the results of the hard effort. As Dan mentioned, I was involved not only in the certification program, but also with the CBOK. I personally have been involved probably in the last 8 years, focused very much on this topic of process analysis. So I'm happy to cover a little bit of the chapter, and then about 2/3 of the material in the chapter, and maybe 1/3 of it from the rest of it from my experience. So you're going to find a little bit of a personal perspective added into the content from the Chapter 4 material. So I was also very pleased to see that Dan had included in each of the chapters an intro from one of the leading thought leaders, if you would, on BPM. And Chapter 4 has an introduction by Elise Olding of Gartner. And I've met Elise at a number of conferences, and I actually was thrilled to see her introduction because I think it really hits home in terms of why process analysis is so important. So if you'll allow, I pulled a few sentences out of the introduction that I want to focus on. Elise starts by talking about the fact that process analysis at the conceptual level is a powerful visual technique to identify holistic and systemic disconnects in the organization. Use it to engage executives to think differently about the process. And she has a couple bullets underneath: rekindle the conversation and bring process analysis to the executive suite. And I'll talk a little bit more about how this actually happened in some of the organizations that I've been with, because it truly is remarkable to see how people need to connect very closely with process to understand it, yet not get hung up in the detail of the day-to-day workings of the organization. So to continue with her quote, she says, process analysis is a means to an end. It is not the end. The outcome of the work must be to generate value for the organization. And I'm going to keep coming back to this point because this is really my understanding of the value of process analysis. So then she goes into some of the downfalls, some of the pitfalls. And she talks about the fact that one of the common mistakes organizations make is to dwell on this as is, get hung up on it. And I've also been in conference rooms where all the walls are covered in model after model, and it's almost an engineering, or maybe the movie, A Beautiful Mind, where there's all this detail, and no one's quite sure of where to begin. So Elise talks in the intro about organizations with a room filled floor to ceiling with process models, charts that the business partner doesn't want to even review or validate. No wonder. And then she says it would take weeks to review. She's even been overwhelmed trying to take it all in. So what problem did you find? What baseline metrics did you document? Any trends becoming evident? Do you have any recommendations? Any quick wins? So if the answer is no, somewhere along the way, the organization has lost the meaning of what the end game is about, delivering value to the business. Now, in the next page, she talks more about an example where effective process analysis was really an enabler. And this company had to quickly spin off, divest an organization in a short period of time. Now, since the executive management already understood their processes, they had what they needed in order to quickly parse out that day-to-day work, how those functions interact, and be able to spin off that organization. It really did help them in a very short period of time to make it happen. So again, what is the value? And let's be mindful of the end game with process analysis. So this chart that I've included here is something that I've used. There's very different, or many different life cycle visuals in the CBOK. And this one is just very simple, starting with planning and strategy. Next, we have analysis, modeling, execution, monitoring, and optimization. And interestingly enough, Emmett Powell presented the modeling last month, and there were many themes and questions that really bring to light the fact that analysis and modeling are so intertwined. We even had some debate during the certification, the CBOK review meetings, talking about whether you have modeling after analysis or analysis together with modeling, because they're hard to separate. So that's really what we want to talk about, is there are some common topics. The themes come over into both chapters, and we're here to leverage those common elements. So on this next slide, I've pulled out the terminology and definitions. Process, this definition appears throughout the CBOK. And process analysis. Most important there for analysis is to create that understanding of the activities and the measures of success. So how well does the process deliver the expectations for the business? How effectively and efficiently do those activities meet the goals? And included here are also the definition of effectiveness and efficiency. I'm sure you have your own, but these are also from the CBOK. So now we're going into the goal. What is the goal? And in the CBOK, the question is, why analyze a process? Well, to gather that information for the organization to make informed decisions assessing the activities of the business. Show how well the business is meeting its objectives. Process analysis, the goal. We'll talk about this a little bit more as we go through how to do it and why we do it. This allows the organization to continually improve the process and monitor the performance, and ultimately to improve the performance of the organization. And I'll tell you, the process analysis that we put together, in my experience, was really an evolution. You start year one and you have 20 core processes pulled together. You start to group them. You start to put them into quadrants. People start to use the terms, the way you categorize them, and you start to be able to have conversations about zooming into the detail of a specific process and zoom out to the broader understanding of the high-level functions and how they interact. And that really doesn't happen right away. It takes time, but it really drives the value for the business, and that's really what we're looking for. So when do you perform process analysis? There are two types here, continuous ongoing analysis, and then on the next slide we'll talk about event-based analysis. So continuous analysis means that it is something the organization is focused on in some regular cycle. For strategic planning, you really should consider the current state of your processes, using a roadmap with a process-centric perspective to think about where you want to invest. Where do we want to build new systems? How do we prioritize the projects, the development efforts? All of these are tied to, first of all, a good understanding of the process. Second of all, a good understanding of the performance of those processes, and also the analysis that you put together in terms of a overarching view of the process to say this one is critical in the organization, it needs attention, it is poorly performing. So strategic planning then starts to pull that together in terms of a longer-term roadmap and also your technology roadmap. Are you going to implement new technology? Many white papers out there on BPMS solutions, whether you're struggling with a legacy system that you may want to rip and replace, or whether you're going to add a layer to improve the efficiency of straight-through processing. And for those of you in the industry of financial services, healthcare, let me think of a few more here, insurance, and on, they're all focused on transactions, the efficiency of those transactions, and very clearly aligned with the technology supporting those processes. Also, continuous monitoring, so where organizations look at their metrics on an ongoing basis. And in many firms that I've worked with, you can see where people have a regular reporting process, not just the volume, but the issues, the exception processes, the things that start to show you may have a performance issue. And that continuous monitoring will happen whether it's done in weekly, monthly, or regular senior management meetings. And that's a way to keep the pulse of the organization focused on the changes that need to happen that may improve performance. And then finally, if you are truly a process-centric organization, you may have your measures for performance management of the process embedded into your human performance and your reward systems. So these are all ways that an organization would do process analysis on a regular basis. Or on the second slide, we're looking at event-based. Something happens and we need to go in and do specific targeted process analysis for a purpose, for an outcome. And in the CBOK, we talk about the fact that a new technology, before you go in to implement, you understand your as is, so you know how much modification or how much you're going to change your process to move it to the new system and limit customizations. You also have the startup venture where you may be having a new process, new division, new business line of service, and you're going to define those processes so they integrate seamlessly into the rest of the organization. I've already touched briefly, and Elise Olding in the intro talked about the fact that you want to be ready with merger and acquisition, not only to spin off the business as in her example, but in some of the situations I've been involved in, as you're bringing in, acquiring an organization, you need to align their processes, select the one that is going to become the new primary process, and quickly move to your future state. Another one that some of the industries that I mentioned are dealing with is regulatory issues. So new regulations come along, and then the business has to be able to. Hello, this is Gabrielle. For some reason, I was lost connection for a moment. We'll pick up where we left off.
Okay,
Dan,
we can hear you again.
You're good. Okay, good. I apologize for that. I'm not sure what happened. So we are now looking at process analysis, the outline. This is the core content that we're going to cover. You begin with preparation to analyze. You look at your scope, select the process, choose the frameworks you're going to use. Then in the next step, you are going to set the context, understand the environment, know the impact of the process, and understand the organization. In performing the analysis, you're going to work with the process owner, make sure you understand all the elements of process ownership, select the team, and decompose the processes. In the last step, we're going to talk about summarizing the findings, identifying the gaps, reviewing your metrics, and documenting recommendations. So in the last session, we talked a little bit about some of the frameworks. Emmett Powell talked about various different organizations that offer the way to construct the high-level view of your processes at the enterprise level. Powell is from one of the larger consulting firms, also a very similar one that is presented at many conferences by firms such as APQC, and most organizations have something similar where you start to break the organization into your governing processes, and this is how you manage the business, what you sell, how you organize and fund the business, whether you're public or privately held. And then you're determining what you're going to sell or provide services, and your core processes then to market and actually deliver, produce those goods and services. And then your supporting layer of processes, the enabling, whether it's the processes that are not visible to the end customer, but are the supporting pillars, if you would, supporting platform for the organization in terms of bringing people in, the accounting, IT, all the other things that make it happen. So in looking at preparation as you get ready to start to analyze a process, knowing where in the organization you're going to be working it's really one of the pieces that help you prepare, because in this visual, you will start to then understand how the processes decompose. So in this next example, I've taken the governance processes and detailed them exactly the way you would see them in one of these models, and it has all of the granular processes underneath these high-level topics. Now, looking along the left-hand side with the numbers 1 through 5, you can actually see some of the C-suite executive roles. You can see the COO in the develop vision and strategy. You can see the head of marketing with number 2. You can also see maybe engineering product development with number 3, and all the way down to number 5 where you're dealing with the chief risk officer. for taking a breather there, and you were able to see the example of the process framework and the way you decompose the processes. The benefits here provide this customer-centric view and accountability for performance. It helps to build that organizational discipline and process-centric understanding. It provides an understanding of the roles and cross-organizational boundaries. So you start to know your business. You can start to understand where there's alignments or gaps in the organizational structure. For example, at one point I was working with a firm where there were 4 different procurement purchasing organizations, and starting to do process analysis in the context of the framework, it became clear that a central procurement function, corporate function, was a gap in the organization. This also equips management to align, redefine processes and the organization. It assists leaders in setting clear and realistic goals and priorities. So next, we're going to set the context and understand the environment. This is where we go to decompose the processes. We just talked, and let me see if we can continue. My apologies. Okay, so we're looking at the enterprise model. We are now decomposing to the business model. The business model depicts the major end-to-end processes and their sub-processes and the interactions across the major functions. The audience here is management, so they start to understand the visual that I showed earlier and the scope of each process group. The activity model is very clearly aligned to the model that was introduced last month. Emmett Powell went through how to model the process and the activities in the process, and this is the activity model. So basically what we've done is drill down from the enterprise to the business process level to the activity model. This is the step-by-step detail that can be followed along to understand the process. The detailed procedure is contained in the workflow model. The workflow model is actually spelling out what happens at each step, a very detailed design of the process. And then the lowest level model is the system model. Here we are talking about the technology that is supporting the process, the data flow, the system input-output, the interfaces required to support business operations. The audience here would be IT and management, and has detail from logical system models to use case models. The system should be referenced to the process to provide traceability, and it really does start to provide a lot of value for the organization when you're able to tie those activities to the supporting technology, so that you clearly have an alignment between what happens within the process as well as within the supporting infrastructure, to pull that all together to understand the total context and the total cost of that process. So we've already covered setting the scope. We've selected the process. We understand the environment. We've looked at the impact of the process, and we understand the organizational context. Now we're stepping in to actually perform the analysis. So first we are selecting the team. We need to work very closely with our executive sponsor, the person who is the key resource to make the change happen. So as you're going through your process analysis, if you are hitting those organizational topics or issues where you do want to make change, you want to be sure that you do have an engaged sponsor that can help make those changes happen. Then you also want to be closely involved with the process owner. You want them engaged in the observation. You want them also very much involved in looking at your observations and recommendations so that they're not viewing it as criticism or fault finding along the way. The next role is the process consultant, and this position, first of all, is critical. This person facilitates the kickoff meetings, is skilled in facilitation, also understands the business, and is responsible for pulling the entire analysis together and summarizing the findings. You also want to engage your technology teams and your peer process owners. You also need to be working with your SMEs, the people who understand the final end products, the deliverables, and peer process owners I've included because many times you are dealing with the upstream and the downstream processes. So once you've pulled this team together, I'm going to focus again on these key roles and talk a little bit about how do you bring these people together. In the modeling session, we talked about the fact that you can do this in a workshop. Sometimes you have many groups together, so you may do a series of different workshops and bring it all together. Sometimes process consultants facilitate what we used to call desk sitting, which is actually going and observing someone doing their work. There are many other different ways that you can set up video viewing of what the person is actually doing, so you can screen share, let's say, the processing steps that someone goes through to understand what happens on a weekly or a daily basis in the process. Most important is that once you've set the expectations and you've had your kickoff meeting to communicate, that you are starting a series of workshops or meetings to conduct this process analysis. It's very important to bring everyone together and give updates on what you've accomplished so far, what remains, keeping regular meetings so that people are informed in terms of what they can expect. You really want to bring all the participants along with you so that by the time you've created the final analysis, people already understand and have possibly even bought into some of the findings and recommendations. One of the things that I've found is that when you bring these roles together, and sometimes you're dealing with the immediate upstream process. So in other words, this group daily gets a report from the sales organization. They start to prepare their part of the process, and it moves through the organization, let's say, toward the month-end close for the financials. Many times the people upstream may not understand what happens to their work products. Many times bringing them together, you start to have immediate understanding around what these problems may be. Or we never realized that you needed this work by the 15th so that you can hit the close process for financials by this date. And sometimes these groups may have worked together for years and years, but never does the organization really have a platform or a meeting where people just get together to understand all of the different elements across the various groups. We actually had some real surprises where one group thought they were putting in some improvements, and they actually were creating a real roadblock for the next group as they were trying to complete their processes, because you were actually creating what you thought was a more efficient process. It was bottlenecking the next group downstream. So now that we've talked about who is actually going to do this work, we go into what are the critical elements that you go through as you perform the analysis. So in going back to last month, we already have a process model. Now we're going to go into all of the detailed understanding of all of the elements behind that model. We want to understand where the customer touch points are. What are the response times? We want to understand what that process capability is. What is the scalability? If you bring in another 5,000 transactions in a week, what does it take? Is it simply handled by more people, or are there other things that have to happen in order to scale the process? How flexible is it? What modifications to change? Then you really want to understand what are some of the performance gaps. So understanding at a high level, let's say you're looking at a financial transaction and you're looking at something that is a straight through process, you would expect maybe 75% of your transactions to go through very simple, through the normal approval process. Then you start to realize in looking at the detail behind the process model that more than 40%, let's say, are handled multiple times because of exception processing. So then you start to have your basis to start to understand, to do the fact-finding as to why such a large volume or high volume are hung up in exception processing. How long does the exception processing take? This becomes a real crux of some of the recommendations and the opportunities for improvement. If people need to go to 3 systems to find those exceptions, to resolve those exceptions, each one of those touch points adds time to the transaction. There's always the customer expectation as to how long it should take, and the exception process always creates those challenges for the organization to have a good understanding of really here's the assumed turnaround time and what is the real turnaround time and what can we do to resolve it. Also, process alignment issues. So in other words, if the handoff for the next group is taking longer or if there are challenges there, should they really be aligned as one group? Have we partitioned groups into separate silos when they really should be under one manager with one objective? In the next slide, I'm focusing on the process metrics, and very important, lots of focus on the overall cost of the end-to-end process. So if this is a high volume transaction and we are focusing on a high percentage of exceptions, we want to understand and show senior management the difference between a typical transaction and an exception process, and have people understand that, okay, if it's twice as expensive to handle an exception process, what can we do to reduce those costs, and how do we begin to manage what is rather seamless in the organization? Sometimes 2 or 3 people are added to handle the volume, not realizing that it's really something internal that should be addressed through other means to deal with the roadblocks that cause those exception processes. Now, as I mentioned earlier, when early in my experience we put together a pretty elementary enterprise process framework, other initiatives across the organization started to use similar approach and align themselves to looking at the cost of the technology. So if this process uses these applications, what is the total in cost for for supporting that process? Then you start to look at all the help desk calls, all the manual for additional processors, seasonal fluctuations, and you start to understand the real cost. And the organization sometimes has an assumed cost, and the reality is if it's very different, people do sit up and pay attention and start to zero in on, okay, how do we resolve this? The next point is data from CRM and social networks. This is something that Elise Olding at Gartner also said that sometimes people forget about, and it's important to keep focused on the fact that your customers have certain expectations. You should be getting that information. Also, user touch points. What is your sales force? What is their feedback? What other data points do you have? And sometimes in pure process analysis or Six Sigma work, those elements aren't necessarily captured. But I think it's an important point that where it's available, it be included in the analysis. We've already talked briefly about the bottlenecks. Straight through versus delay is truly important to go and analyze to see if you can remove that non-value add. Other factors to consider, I've already touched briefly on these organizational factors. Do you have that acceptance for those opportunities to change? Have you looked at the organization to see if there's a natural fit between these functions? Are there other functions that should be grouped together in order to keep the process as efficient and as effective as it could be? The other point is social networks or other networks. Many of the employee or user processing systems have notes next to each transaction, or someone calls in on an account with a concern. And all that information is documented, and many times it's documented in systems separate and aside from the core processing or transaction based system. So if that data is available, how do you gather that business intelligence? And many times those comments from a customer calling in or a processor talking to a customer is valid information that should be highlighted so that you can move it forward for process alignment, and process analysis. So we've already touched on the organizational alignment internally. Is the process clearly aligned within the structure? And then industry benchmark comparison. This is something that senior managers always look for is, okay, if this is our industry and this is our process and these are your recommendations, what do the other firms in our industry do, and how do they go about executing those processes? So lots of information there that also help paint the picture for process analysis. So now we've covered the majority of the topics, and we're moving into summarizing the findings. And this is really critical because in my experience, when you've analyzed a group of processes, in the end, that report should become a benchmark study, if you would, for the organization. Technology people can use it to look at their roadmap for development or changes. The business looks at it to see what they should be thinking about for opportunities for change that may not require system changes, people training issues, and organizational issues. So generally, some of the elements that should be included is an overview of the process. Along with the process model, I typically look for a CBOK where you have the suppliers' inputs, the outputs and customers of the process, the gaps in the performance of the analysis that we've already touched on, making sure again that it's fact-finding, not fault-finding. Processes evolve, they're not designed, so many times the gap in the process is not tied to intentional oversight or deliberate act. Many redundancies in the process that might be candidates to be eliminated should also be highlighted, as well as the cost data and the metrics for these observations. Obviously, the most important point that people want to focus on is what are those short-term opportunities versus the long-term investment opportunities. So if we are going to redesign the system, invest in a BPMS, we should be focused on that and look at the people, the process, and the technology when it comes to the recommendations, again, summarizing the comparison to benchmark data. So in the final step, as you summarize your findings, we want to consider the process maturity level, and I'll touch on this concept briefly because it's also touched on later in one of the later chapters. This is the model that's used in the CBOK, talking about the fact that an organization should understand where their processes fall in this continuum. This is from Chapter 4, the graphic here, talking about the fact that most processes, if we're starting with number 1, and aware, if you're at a level 1, that means the process is managed, basic to the individual unit or department. At level 2, define the process, documentate. First of all, the process is documented. The documentation is owned, updated. There's a shared understanding beyond the processor about the process, and informal process planning. Most organizations will fall somewhere between a 3 and a 4. Processes being aligned means that they have common goals and objectives. There's collaboration across related processes for process change, no longer siloed. Integrated means the processes are seamless, managed within that single business unit, common vision, and continuously improved. And in my experience, most senior managers didn't want to hear about optimized because it is always a goal, but that means that it's managed consistently at the enterprise level, and change is simulated end to end. It's something that many organizations are striving for. So this is just a quick example from a conference presentation where there's a series of questions behind this assessment, and this is for your IT enterprise architecture processes. And basically, this gives you the visual of how you would go through and analyze all of the levels to come up with your conclusion. In this case, they stated that it is level 2 and processes are developing. So in other words, this group of processes is in emerging state, working toward a level 3. So one of the things that we started with is the value of the organization, and the value to the organization is based on moving toward a process-centric organization. So if you're going to do process analysis, you need to have governance in place, you need to have your methodology well defined, and you need to have an understanding of the technology that supports those processes. So if you're going to do process analysis and you only have one of these columns, this is really a 9-column focus, and so it is an evolution that simply by doing process analysis alone or simply by having a BPMS solution, until you bring it together in a broader context and you're able to deliver process analysis within this pillared structure, it is going to be a very challenging analysis, almost back to the introduction where Elise Olding talked about the fact that sometimes it's analysis simply for the sake of analysis. So this is really the end goal, and it's very important to keep in mind that moving the organization forward means that not only do you have a good understanding of the organization, the process at a high level, but you also have that those fundamentals in place to move it forward and to truly value or recognize the value of process analysis. Okay, I've included 2 slides here in the end that talk about the success factors and the lessons learned. These came straight from the CBOK, so you can also take a look at these on your own. We've talked about each one of them. I would say executive leadership is critical, and also having that understanding of all those elements that we talked about in gathering the analysis for the organization and pulling it together. So at this point, I wanted to leave a few minutes for questions, and I'll open it up for Dan to forward those questions.
Gabriel, thank you very much for a great presentation. Excuse me, could the people who are in attendance please key in questions? Okay. We have one here. And let's see. Where can you get the PowerPoints? First of all, we have recorded the session, and the session will be available through the ABPMP website. Gabriel, are you going to be putting the slides out there for download, or should someone contact you directly?
I already provided them, so they will be provided, yes.
Okay, so if you go out to the ABPMP website, you'll first of all be able to see the entire presentation again, and second of all, be able to download the PowerPoint slides. Next question, is there a difference in analysis focus between private and government entities? Gabriel?
Well, here's my immediate thought is that in a organization, the types of organizations that I've been with in my experience doing this sort of analysis, you can really take these findings to a senior management team, and a group can start to prioritize where you would make improvements and recommendations. I would say sometimes in government sector, the processes are rather much larger scale, and you may not have a committee to work with to make those decisions and to prioritize those improvement opportunities. So it really is, who is your target audience for the analysis? Now, if you are looking to standardize process or make improvements within a segment or a silo of, I don't want to use the term silo, or within a specific area, it certainly is doable, but I do think that as stated in some of the introductory slides, the objective is for the organization to better understand their processes and make decisions in a holistic way. So hopefully that answers your question. So I would say they're similar end results, but different as far as how you get there.
Great. Any other questions? Gabriel, I'm sure you'll be happy to note that I've received several different notes here that, first of all, thank you and compliment you on the session. Another question just came in. What are the best references for analysis?
Can you read that again, Dan? What is the references for analysis?
What are the best references for analysis?
I think I may have a skewed perspective because I've worked with many of the larger consulting firms, and they are really the experts in being able to pull that reference material together, and especially when it comes to a formal report on their findings for the state of the process, if you would. And so if you do have the opportunity to take a look at some models like that, that really is an excellent reference. I also think that the CBOK has some great references as you go through looking at the various chapters. It really is unique to the organization and unique to your management teams in terms of what it is they're looking for. And I would be happy to say that there are some organizations that may not be as focused on industry benchmarks as some of the companies I've worked for, and so it varies from organization to organization.
Okay, next question, Gabriel. What are your preferred tools for performance analysis?
Well, the modeling system is critical, and preferred tools means that you will be able to connect the end of one process to the beginning of another and do that visually and do that with a system, whether you're using Visio, which does it in a very basic way, or some of the other more powerful business process management tools that allow you to really understand the organization. I also like some of the systems that allow you to then put the detail about the process analysis behind each step. So at this step, the processor will be not only looking at the form signed by the customer, but they're also looking at the, if you would, the account, to look at the characteristics of the account to see if this transaction is allowed. So in other words, you put that together behind the model and you start to build an understanding at each step of what process is telling you, and then pulling it together in terms of the high level
Couple moments left in the sessions, scheduled session. Any final questions from anyone? Nothing is coming in, so at this point...
What is the next topic, Chapter 5?
You know, I would have to... You would have to ask that.
Sorry, I caught you off guard. Well, thank you all for attending.
Thank you all, and we'll certainly have the title ready. I don't. You did catch me off guard with that one. I'd have to look it up. It's been so long. So thank you all for attending, and Gabriel, thank you for a great session. We've got quite a few compliments on the session, and so with that, again, thank you, and we will end the session.
Thank you.